is that the jack inputs are guitar level. So that's really very sensitive. So you cannot just plug a signal from the modulator directly into
MPX 100.
Yeah. That's why I used to have the different note processor, the one with the audio taper still. That used to be super useful. So since the MIDI interface, I kind of miss that audio taper still a little bit.
Yeah, well, I always think it's best to patch up effects through a mixing panel. The effect sends and returns, and then you can set the sensitivities.
No, I don't also have a mixer. So
really cheap Behringer
but
mixers.
this ruins the sound.
Actually, the Behringer mixers, they sound very clean.
Yeah.
You have to replace them after 2 or 3 years because then the pots start crackling, but they're so cheap that I wish they would use really good long life pots, because I don't like equipment that gives up after 2 years. But okay, for price,
but that for me is the biggest change with modular at all. The fact that it's so dynamic, so it's difficult to find the right audio output level that you don't either, it's much too soft, or you immediately clip all the stuff you have going into it. We fiddle around a little bit. My machine has in the back those 4 outputs. We fiddled a little bit.
Very custom. I remember the echo thing with the envelope generator, which is really simple.
I thought it was involved also a dual fader, didn't it? Or
because basically, what you do is you take a sound and
for you?
Okay, I just, instead of using the VCA and the filter, I plug it into bipolar VCA, because with a bipolar VCA you can actually invert the signal. Maybe we can show that on the scope. And then we use the envelope output on the VCA and modulate it. So because then you have an interesting situation, because you can, if you turn this knob to the right, you basically have a constant level plus a bit of the envelope. But if you turn it to the left, especially if you have here's a situation where it's silent, but if you turn it a bit to the left, then it opens up again, but it goes through silence, but the phase is reversed, and then so it comes up again. But if you do it somewhat faster, fast enough, because the little tail at the end is in opposite phase, the mind thinks that it comes from a different direction. So now we just invert the envelope. So it's a poor man's reverb. silent for a moment, it's like, oh, there's a reflection coming from somewhere. Especially at a somewhat higher rate, it sounds more convincing. And we can modulate the release time. So if we do that very slowly. We have another trick to sort of create a certain slow change. Which comes to the very interesting question that people many times ask me: why do you put a sample and hold into an envelope generator? And maybe it's good to explain this. That basically has to do with frequency modulation. Because if you have a modulatable envelope generator, basically what you modulate is time, the envelope times. And if you modulate time, you're basically doing frequency modulation, because time modulation, frequency works on the timeline, so you're doing something on the timeline. And then there is a certain thing that you need to know about frequency modulation, and that is that if you modulate, for instance, if you modulate one oscillator with another oscillator, if the pitch of the oscillator that modulates is very high, then you hear very little effect, but when the pitch of the modulating oscillator is very low, you hear much more effect. So for instance, if we just listen to an oscillator, and we give it this pitch, and we start to modulate the pitch of this oscillator with another oscillator, and I set that one to a relatively low pitch, then you hear that the modulation depth is quite deep. But now if I start to pitch this one up, then you hear a little bit of high stuff, but it's not really very deep, it's just very mildly, but see, now we swing all over the place. So the rule of frequency modulation is that if you want to modulate something with a relatively high pitch, which itself is relatively low, you have to modulate much deeper to get a similar kind of effect than the other way around. Now, if you look at the envelope generator as something that creates a waveform, it only creates one cycle of a waveform, but it does create a waveform, then that waveform is of a very low frequency. That means if you try to start to modulate the envelope times, you need really much slower signals to hear the effect very well. So if I, for instance, now start to, let's see what's the best way to do that. If I do it manually, that's relatively slow, so that works quite nicely. So if I start to modulate this with a triangle wave, and the triangle wave is very slow, then you hear a lot of effect. But if I speed the LFO up, you hear something, but it's not that excessive. So then the question is, can we do something about it? And well, the answer is very simple. You take a sample and hold, and you let the sample and hold basically sample a value on the moment of the gate pulse. Because if you do that, it doesn't really matter at what speed, at what pitch a signal comes into the sample and hold. It will sample it, keep it stable during the whole note, and then when it samples again, it might sample a completely different value, and no matter what the frequency is of the pitch that comes in. So if instead of doing it this way, I now put it into the sample and hold, and I use the output of the sample and hold to modulate the release CV, then instantly, and now it also doesn't matter exactly what the speed is, it's only the interference beat between the rate of the envelope and the LFO that basically create a rhythm that is always basically the same depth. To go deep in this, it's a matter of statistics. You actually change the statistics. Because if you do frequency modulation, then the relationship, the pitch relationship between both frequencies have a certain statistic property. But if you use the sample and hold in between, you actually change that statistic property, and the chance that you have a high and low value is equal. So it spreads out much more. So now I can even modulate this with a audio rate signal, and this is now a really high pitch. I think that this pitch is this pitch. But if I would not use the sample and hold, no effect, because that pitch is really so high that, you know, when that envelope is going really slow, well, that really high effect is not able to move that envelope very much in level momentarily. So and there it is back again. So basically, the reason why you use the sample and hold is to sort of equalize out the effect to the same effect depth over any frequency range. Something that you have to think about really deeply to understand, but it just simply works. Very simple. And it's a trick that you can, sample and holds you can use for many different things, but especially the main, one of the very interesting things to use it for is for the principle to change the statistic properties of something. Okay, I cannot explain this in a more easy way than I'm doing it now. So, to have a so you see it. Always works, no matter what frequency you use. Always doing something. It's only if you make the modulating frequency really low that you get more interesting things happening in the pattern, but at least you hear things happen. So, and then another interesting thing of sample and holds is that if you have a sample and hold on the modulation input of an oscillator, and so that basically means that if you listen to an oscillator, you feed the sample and hold output into the modulation input of the oscillator. At the moment we're not sampling a lot, well, a little bit of internal offset voltage. And then, for instance, we take another oscillator. I will just put it in a relatively low rate here. So, of course, we need to clock the sample and hold. Just was the envelope repeat mode here. But basically what we do is we actually clock the sample and hold by the oscillator. Now if the oscillator is at a very high rate, you just hear the waveform. But then if we speed up this oscillator, which without the sample and hold would basically mean that the modulation effect would become less and less and less. Now it's sort of quite interesting sort of soft sync effects, depending. And that is completely different than if I would actually modulate do it like this. mostly it's interesting to actually filter this. Now one of the things that you can do is that you feed the sample and hold output into the matrix, because then we can use the same sample and hold output signal to modulate the filter. Interesting effects. And then we still have a sine wave oscillator left here that we can use to audio rate modulate the filter a little bit, which there are certain instances that it suddenly, because the chaotic system gets caught in a stable pattern that's really short. And then you just use a little bit of fine tune. And because a chaotic system, if you go from one balanced state to another balanced state, but then you go back to the parameters of the first balanced state, it doesn't mean it goes back to that first balanced state, it might actually go to the third balanced state. So it's not really. Modulated separately is that you can actually get the idea that they create two layers on top of each other. Nice noise sounds with this, and without any reverb. It sounds like there is a depth to it. Don't put too much reverb in these sounds, it will kill it. So I still have the sample and hold output some more here in the matrix available. So for instance, I can actually also feed this back into the frequency of this oscillator and see what happens if I add modulation here as well and then play with the knobs. So just to give you an idea of a relatively very simple patch, because we have an oscillator that has a sample and hold on its modulation input. And that sample and hold is clocked by the same oscillator. So that whenever that oscillator makes one period of a waveform, it samples a new value, and that value changes its pitch, so the next period will be of a different length in time. So every single period of the waveform will basically have a different length in time. Sort of a little bit like granular synthesis kind of thing. Then, what do you sample? That's the question. Well, basically, because it's a sample and hold, it can sample a signal of any pitch. That's also a good thing to know. So that can be a second oscillator. Now we can put the output of the oscillator into a filter, modulate that filter, maybe with the same oscillator or the other oscillator or whatever, or the sample and hold output. And then if you put the sample and hold output also in the frequency input of the oscillator that gets sampled, then of course everything gets totally chaos. Because then every time when it samples a new sample, it not only changes the time until it will take a new sample, but it will also change what it samples. So it changes two things, and then basically you have a proper chaotic system. And then if you have
Is there a way that you could...
and you see that sometimes with very mute changes, you get many different patterns.
That's really the thing I learned from Hordijk, since that there's the sensitivity of the knobs. So
You can just play it with fine tuning. I think that if you play with this for 24 hours, you will discover that only this patch has a unlimited amount of kind of sounds. They have a specific kind of character, as you can hear, but there's a lot of variation there. And so I know that many people that actually use this machine, they often just sit down for an evening with a recording device running, and then just play and just record a couple of hours, and then you just cut out the interesting parts, and then you can rearrange it in your Ableton or Logic or whatever, and put it in your sampler and play it from the sampler or whatever, and in that way you have an enormous amount of different kinds of sounds available. My personal opinion is that I like there to be a little bit of humor and lightness in electronic music. So I like funny sounds. Sounds that do funny things. There's nothing wrong with that. It's happy sounds, happy electronic sounds. It doesn't always have to be heavy and, you know, and industrial, depressive sometimes, you know. Sometimes and you can combine it, of course. That's also a very good thing to put a little bit of lightness somewhere in your industrial performance. Actually, there's quite a lot of variations that you can do with the sample and hold on the input of an oscillator, because at this moment we use a second oscillator as the input to the sample and hold. Now, that can actually also be the first oscillator, but then you have to do something, because imagine that you have a sample and hold, and that sample and hold is triggered by the first oscillator, by an oscillator. It basically triggers when the waveform from the oscillator goes from negative to positive, so when it crosses 0 volt. Now, if you also use that same oscillator at the sample input of the sample and hold, it means it would always sample 0, because the time when it samples the waveform is 0, and you sample the waveform and it's 0. So that wouldn't work. But imagine that you would delay the oscillator signal slightly before it goes into the sample and hold. Because it's delayed, it will have some non-zero value. And it will sample that value. That will change the oscillator pitch. So when it resamples again, then because of the delay and the changed frequency, it will change another sample. So if you would introduce a time delay, then it should work. So let's see how we can introduce some time delay, and if we can make it work.